Hey folks, are y'all ready to hop on a fascinating journey through the pages of biblical history with us? Today, we're delving into the intricate relationships between the descendants of Ishmael and Israel, exploring the conflicts, rivalries, and profound meanings behind these ancient events. Before we dive into this immersion, I'd like to make a special request. If you're enjoying the content, smash that like button, subscribe to the channel, and hit the bell to get all our updates. And don't forget, at the end of our reflection, we'll come together in a prayer of gratitude and reflection. So, get ready to dive into this incredible journey with us. Let's go. At the outset of our journey, Ishmael emerges as a pivotal figure in the ancient biblical scriptures. He is the firstborn son of Abraham, the man to whom God promised to be the father of many nations. The promise was made to Abraham as he gazed upon the starry sky, a vision foreshadowing the magnitude of the promises to come. However, as time passed, challenges arose. Abraham and his wife Sarah eagerly awaited the fulfillment of the promise, but the blessing of parenthood had not yet materialized. Hope began to be replaced by uncertainties. Sarah, in search of a solution, suggested a custom of the time, the idea of having a child through her Egyptian servant, Hagar. Though common at the time, this practice would eventually trigger a series of conflicts and dilemmas. Initially, Hagar felt exalted, and the joy of conception turned into disdain for Sarah. What seemed like a viable solution quickly became a source of tension. The situation escalated when Sarah began to treat Hagar cruelly. The atmosphere in Abraham's household became fraught with resentment and anguish. The relationship between the two women deteriorated rapidly, while Abraham found himself in the midst of an increasingly complex and emotionally charged situation. The consequences of Abraham and Sarah's decision reverberated for generations. The story of Ishmael and his relationship with his half-brother Isaac is a testimony to the complexities of human choices and the ramifications that can arise from them. However, even in the face of these challenges, there are lessons to be learned and solutions to be sought. The fate of Ishmael and his family is not sealed by conflict, but rather by the way they choose to confront and resolve their differences. Just like Abraham and Sarah, we all encounter dilemmas and challenges in our lives. We may find ourselves in situations where apparent solutions end up complicating things further. Nevertheless, it is important to remember that there is always a way to find an exit, a solution that respects the dignity and rights of all involved. It is through dialogue, empathy, and the pursuit of mutual understanding that we can transcend our difficulties and build a more harmonious future. Ishmael's story reminds us of the importance of not only recognizing the consequences of our actions, but also actively seeking ways to correct and reconcile when things go wrong. Only through forgiveness, understanding, and collaboration can we transform conflicts into opportunities for growth and unity. Ishmael's journey, although filled with challenges, is also a journey of hope and redemption. A journey that reminds us of the human capacity to overcome adversity and find the path to peace and reconciliation. Feeling lost and oppressed, she fled into the desert. The name Ishmael, given to the son that Hagar carried in her womb, was a prayer. God will hear. It was a reminder that even amidst difficulties, God was attentive to the lives of Abraham, Sarah, and Hagar. They were intertwined by complex choices, intense emotions, and unwavering faith in a divine promise. Ishmael's journey was just beginning, and the desert would witness his quest for identity and purpose. Next to a spring in the desert, a magical encounter was about to take place, an encounter that would shape Ishmael's destiny and signal the beginning of a new phase in his story. A voice echoed in the silence of the desert. "Where have you come from, and where are you going?" The voice belonged to the angel of the Lord who appeared before Hagar, a woman on a journey of despair. With tears in her eyes, she confessed, "I am fleeing from the presence of my mistress Sarai." The angel, the messenger from on high, spoke with authority and gentleness. "Return to your mistress," he advised, "and submit yourself to her authority. Excessively your descendants," proclaimed the angel, "so many that they cannot be counted." Then the profound news arrived. "Behold, you are pregnant and will bear a son. Call him Ishmael, for the Lord has heard your suffering." The angel painted a picture of Ishmael's destiny. "He will be a wild man," he predicted, "his hand against all men and the hand of all men against him. He will live in the presence of all his brothers." Dominated by this divine encounter, Hagar felt seen in a way she had never experienced before. "You are the God who sees," she proclaimed, tears mixing with reverence. "Do you also see the one who sees me?" In honor of this encounter, the well became known as Bir Lahai Roa, a symbol of the God who had been in her distress. And so Hagar gave birth to a son, and Abraham called him Ishmael, a testimony to the power of faith, the resilience of the human spirit, and the unbreakable connection between the divine and the mortal. Over time, Ishmael's presence occupied a unique place in the family dynamic. The practice of using a servant to bear a child when the wife was barren, common at that time, led to Ishmael's birth. But this was only the beginning of his journey. Born when Abraham was 86 years old, Ishmael would grow up as part of a unique tapestry, a life linked both to promise and uncertainty. Years passed, and the tapestry of Ishmael's life began to unfold. His father Abraham moved his tent to the shade of the terebinth trees, and an altar was built in Hebron, a symbol of faith and devotion. However, Ishmael's story was intricately intertwined with unexpected twists. At the age of 13, a covenant was forged through circumcision, uniting the members of Abraham's household in a sacred bond. As the sands of time continued to shift, Ishmael and his mother faced banishment, a painful separation. Their family wandered through the desert, teetering on the brink of despair, until the compassion of God was stirred, and their cries were heard in the vastness of the desert. The journey of young Ishmael was marked by trials and triumphs, a story echoing with the resonance of divine intervention and the enduring spirit of a people destined for greatness. Providing water, Ishmael lived the rest of his life in the desert, especially in the wilderness region of Paran, with the help of God. It was here that he learned to handle the bow. His marriage to an Egyptian explains his proximity to Egypt, as well as his mother's heritage. His presence at Abraham's funeral and the fact that Esau married the daughter of Ishmael demonstrate that he did not completely sever ties with the main patriarchal lineage. In Genesis 25:9, in the New International Version we read, his sons Isaac and Ishmael buried him in the cave of Machpelah near Mamre, in the field of Ephron, son of Zohar the Hittite. So Ishmael went to Asa and took Mahalath, the daughter of Ishmael and sister of Nebaioth, to be his wife, in addition to the wives he already had. Ishmael lived 137 years in Genesis 28:9. In the New International Version it is mentioned, "So he went to Ishmael and married Mahalath, the sister of Nebaioth and daughter of Ishmael." Ishmael, despite his journeys in the desert and his nomadic life, maintained ties that transcended the boundaries of the patriarchal family. God characterizes Ishmael's personality, like that of a wild donkey in the sense of being a wandering name. He releases the wild donkey that runs through the hills of the desert, his home where he finds food. They scoff at the crowds of the city, do not obey the voice of those who guide them. Jeremiah 2:24. Ishmael would become a prominent figure outside the covenant established by God, a prosperous nation with organizational structures similar to Israel's, but without direct experience of the covenant. Genesis 17:20-21. As for Ishmael, I have heard you. I will surely bless him. I will make him fruitful and will greatly increase his numbers. He will be the father of 12 rulers, and I will make him into a great nation. The son born of a parallel promise forged his own path, being recognized and blessed by God, but with a destiny unfolding parallel to that of the chosen people through the covenant. These are the divine reflections regarding Ishmael, a man whose personality resembles that of a wild donkey, wandering through the vast expanses of the desert and tracing a unique path in the narrative of human history. New International Version. And as for Ishmael, I have heard you. I will surely bless him. I will make him fruitful and will greatly increase his numbers. He will be the father of 12 rulers, and I will make him into a great nation. Though Ishmael was not part of God's direct covenant with Abraham, his journey and legacy remain intrinsically linked to the fabric of biblical history and the formation of the nation that would emerge from the sands of time. And so, unfolded the divine covenant. A nation will come from you, and I will establish my covenant between me, you, and your descendants throughout the generations. An everlasting covenant to be God to you and your descendants. I also give you and your descendants the land in which you are a stranger, all the land of Canaan as an everlasting possession, and I will be their God. Genesis 17:7-8. I will establish my covenant as an everlasting covenant between me and you and your future descendants to be your God, and the God of your descendants. I will give to you and to them the land in which you now live as a stranger, all the land of Canaan, where you will be strangers, God said to Abraham. As for you, keep. In an eternal covenant, God established a covenant with Abraham and his descendants. This covenant transcended generations, marked by a visible sign: circumcision. In Genesis 17, verses 10-11, the need for all males, whether direct descendants or foreigners, to be circumcised as part of this covenant is emphasized. This act, performed 8 days after birth, was an indelible mark of the connection between God and his people. Circumcision was not just a physical rite, but a symbol of belonging to the community of faith, a tangible expression of the special relationship between God and his chosen people. Those who refused to be circumcised deliberately broke this covenant, subjecting themselves to exclusion from the people of God. The importance of this pact was evidenced by its continuity throughout generations. The 8th day after birth was marked by this ritual, indicating the incorporation of the newborn into the community of faith. This included not only those born into the family, but also those acquired by money, showing that God's covenant extended to all members of the community, regardless of their origin or social status. For Abraham, this covenant also involved his wife Sarai. God made a specific statement about her which would surely have profound ramifications for the future of the lineage chosen by God. But what this statement meant for Sarai, and how it would affect the fulfillment of divine promises, only time would reveal. From that moment on, God made a specific promise to Abraham, now called Sarah. He would bless her and give her a son, Isaac, emphasizing that her descendants would be remarkable, generating nations and kings. Genesis 17:15-16, New International Version. Abraham, faced with this divine promise, expressed his disbelief, questioning if a 100-year-old man could have a son, and if Sarah, at 90 years old, could give birth. God reiterated his promise, assuring that Sarah would indeed give birth to a son, Isaac. As for Ishmael, Abraham's already born son, God also promised to bless him and make him fruitful, generating 12 princes and becoming a great nation. However, the divine covenant would be established specifically with Isaac, the son that Sarah would give him next year, Genesis 17:19-21. Thus, at this crucial moment in history, the saga of the divine covenant continued, with God renewing his promises and outlining the future of Abraham, Sarah, Ishmael, and Isaac. The fulfillment of these divine promises would shape not only the destiny of these individuals, but also the course of the history of an entire nation. The divine word ceased and God departed from Abraham. Abraham then took Ishmael, his son, along with all those born in his household and all those acquired by money, and circumcised the flesh of their foreskins on that same day, as ordered by God. At the time of circumcision, Abraham was 99 years old, while Ishmael, his son, was 13 years old. Thus, Abraham, Ishmael, and all the men of the household, whether born into the family or acquired by money from foreigners, were circumcised. This action marked the consummation of a commitment to God and the covenant, a permanent mark that bound Abraham, Ishmael, and all those under the roof of his house to this divine promise. The contrast between the promised national greatness in Genesis 21:13 and 18, in the New International Version, and the personal experience of the covenant revealed much about what this covenant truly involved. Genesis 17:22-27 shows that the covenant should not be identified solely with circumcision, no matter how significant. This identification may seem necessary due to Genesis 17:10, where God commands circumcision as a sign of the covenant. However, although Ishmael was circumcised according to God's command, he was not the definitive sign of the covenant. Nevertheless, Abraham and Sarah treated Ishmael as the son promised by God, even when God revealed that Sarah would give birth to a son. Abraham was perplexed as to why this was necessary, instead of having Ishmael as the heir. Still, after the birth of Isaac, Abraham treated Ishmael kindly and was saddened by Sarah's desire to reject him. Sarah, on the other hand, saw Ishmael as a threat to Isaac's position in the family and sought to have him expelled. God, in turn, visited Sarah with the fulfillment of promises, blessing her with the birth of a son in her old age. Genesis 21, 1, 2, New International Version. The Lord visited Sarah as he had said and did for her what he had promised. Sarah became pregnant and bore a son to Abraham in his old age at the very time God had promised. Thus, the dynamics of Abraham's family, divine promises, and personal relationships continued to shape the destiny of these biblical figures and influence the narrative of faith. And so time unfolds, as per God's will. When Isaac, the son born of the union of Abraham and Sarah, came into the world, Abraham gave him this name. Isaac was circumcised by Abraham when he was 8 days old, following God's commandment. Abraham, now at 100 years old, witnessed the birth of his son Isaac. Sarah, amazed, exclaimed, "God has brought me laughter, and everyone who hears about this will laugh with me." Genesis 21:6, 7. And God, reflecting on the irony of the situation, asked who had told Abraham that Sarah would nurse children. But despite expectations, God granted them a son in their old age. Isaac grew and was weaned, an event celebrated with a great feast by Abraham. However, Sarah observed Hagar's son, the Egyptian, mocking Isaac. This deeply disturbed her, leading her to ask Abraham to expel Hagar and her son Ishmael. She insisted that the son of the slave woman should not share the same prominence with Isaac. Genesis 21:10, 11. So she said to Abraham, "Get rid of that slave woman and her son, for that woman's son will never share in the inheritance with my son Isaac." Abraham's distress over Ishmael was evident. But despite his turmoil, God directed Abraham to heed Sarah's request and expel Hagar and Ishmael. God also promised that Ishmael would be made into a nation due to his kinship with Abraham. Abraham obediently rose early in the morning, prepared provisions, and gave them to Hagar. Then he sent them into the wilderness of Beersheba. Genesis 21:14, 16. As soon as Hagar and Ishmael departed, they faced hardships in the desert. When the water in the skin was used up, Hagar placed Ishmael under a bush and moved away, unable to watch his imminent death. But God heard the boy's cry and sent the angel of the Lord to comfort her, promising to make Ishmael into a great nation. God opened Hagar's eyes, and she saw a well of water. Ishmael grew up in the wilderness of Paran, becoming skilled in the use of the bow. Genesis 20:17-21. Thus, even in the face of difficulties and expulsion, God showed his mercy and care for Ishmael and Hagar, promising them a future and providing for their needs in the desert. The angel of God from heaven called Hagar and asked, "What troubles you, Hagar? Do not be afraid, for God has heard the boy's cry where he lies. Lift the boy up and take him by the hand, for I will make him into a great nation." Genesis 21:17-18. Then God opened Hagar's eyes, and she saw a well. She went there, filled the skin with water, and gave the boy a drink. Ishmael grew up in the wilderness of Paran, becoming a skilled archer. His mother found a wife for him from the land of Egypt. During this time, Abimelech became the commander of his army. They sought a covenant of friendship with Abraham, acknowledging God's blessing on his life. Abraham agreed, but also rebuked Abimelech over a dispute related to a well. Genesis 21:32-34. Thus Abraham dealt with Abimelech, and the two swore an oath by God. Abraham gave Abimelech 7 ewe lambs as a pact, and they called that place Beersheba, where the two had sworn an oath. The interactions between Abraham, Ishmael, Isaac, and Hagar continue to reveal the complexity of family relationships and how faith and divine promises shape the history of these characters. Abimelech confronted Abraham, saying that no one had informed him about the incident, and Abraham then offered sheep and cattle to Abimelech, making a covenant between them. Abraham separated 7 ewe lambs from the flock and set them aside. When Abimelech asked the significance of these separated lambs, Abraham explained that they would serve as witnesses that he had dug the well, leading to the naming of the place Beersheba, where they made a covenant. Genesis 20:32. After the covenant, Abimelech and his army departed for the land of the Philistines. Abraham in turn planted a tamarisk tree in Beersheba and invoked the name of the Lord, the eternal God. Abraham remained in the land of the Philistines for many days. The planting of the tamarisk tree served as a sign of permanence and fidelity, making that location a landmark of his journey and the covenants made in that place. Abraham's decision to send Hagar and Ishmael away was part of this context of covenants and interactions between peoples and leaders. Genesis 20:32. Not a specific action of Ishmael, but rather a general perception of a threat to Isaac's position as Abraham's legitimate son and heir of divine promises. The ambiguity of the word mocking raises questions about the precise interpretation of the text and whether Sarah's concerns were grounded in a real threat or her own perception. This complexity in the narrative highlights the dynamics of family relationships and tensions among the different members of Abraham's family. Ishmael, Hagar's son, seemed to challenge the established norms of the time. Although children of maidservants could be considered inferior, expulsion was not a common practice. Abraham, in following only God's commandment, even if contrary to contemporary practices, suggested that his action was not aligned with the standards of the time. This raises the question of whether Ishmael represented a threat for some specific reason, or if his mere existence was considered a threat. The term mocking in Genesis 21:9 is ambiguous in its actual meaning. The text in Genesis 20:9 mentions that Sarah saw Ishmael, Hagar's son, mocking. But it is not clear if Ishmael was actually mocking or simply playing with Isaac. The word mocking is ambiguous in its meaning and does not necessarily imply scorn. Sarah's objection to Ishmael seems to be more related to a perception of threat than to a specific action of Ishmael. The story of Ishmael and Isaac, although commonly contrasted, should not be seen only as a matter of competition or divine favoritism. These narratives reveal the complexity of family relationships and how divine intervention shaped the destiny of these biblical characters. When analyzing the saga of Ishmael in Genesis, it becomes apparent that his figure is often used to highlight aspects of the divine plan that transcend natural norms or social conventions of the time. While Isaac was the son of Abraham's legitimate wife Sarah, Ishmael was the son of Hagar, Sarah's Egyptian maidservant. This distinction in origin made Ishmael and Isaac symbolic representations of different facets of the divine purpose. God's preference for Isaac as the heir of the promises made to Abraham was aligned with the social traditions of the time, where legitimate sons were favored. However, Sarah's rejection of Hagar and Ishmael, and later the divine order for their expulsion, served to underscore the contrast between the two sons of Abraham. Despite being treated as opposing examples, Ishmael and Isaac share a common destiny as descendants of Abraham. The genealogy of Ishmael, described in Genesis and 1 Chronicles, shows that his sons became leaders of tribes and established communities around the regions where they dwelt. This detailed genealogy highlights the importance of Ishmael's descendants in history and the formation of nations. Therefore, instead of being seen merely as rivals, Ishmael and Isaac represent complementary aspects of the divine plan, each playing a significant role in fulfilling the promises made to Abraham. The Bible records interactions between the descendants of Isaac, the Israelites, and the Ishmaelites, showing how these groups were often in conflict, reflecting tensions among the different lineages descending from Abraham. However, it is important to note that this hostility is not a permanent feature, but rather a part of the complex dynamics between these nations. The genealogical record of Ishmael, with his 12 sons, is notable for its similarity to other biblical accounts that mention 12 descendants. This symmetry suggests an underlying divine pattern, a kind of numerical symbolism that permeates the biblical narrative. The descendants of Ishmael, like those of Jacob and Esau, played important roles in the formation of nations and in the history of God's people. The Ishmaelite tribes, established in the region of the Paran Desert, followed in the footsteps of their ancestors, remaining in an area that reflected their heritage and traditions. Their presence in this desert region brought them into close contact with other tribes and nations, often resulting in conflicts and varied alliances. Although Ishmael's story is often seen as parallel to that of Isaac and his descendants, it is a vital part of the biblical narrative and contributes to a broader understanding of divine promises and the complexity of human relationships. Genesis 16:12 describes Ishmael as a wild man, whose hand would be against everyone and everyone's hand against him. This description illustrates the complexity of the relationships between the descendants of Ishmael and Israel, with conflicts and rivalries arising throughout history. Ishmael is depicted as a wild man whose hand would be against everyone, and everyone's hand against him. He was to dwell in the presence of all his brothers. Finally, the Ishmaelites are associated with the Midianites, some of the descendants of Keturah, in some passages suggesting an overlap of the two terms. The term Ishmaelite is applied to the Midianites and the same group that receives both names in Genesis 37:25-28, where Joseph's brothers sell him to a caravan of traders, and in Genesis 37:36-39, where Joseph is sold to Potiphar in Egypt. There is no need to distinguish between an immediate account and an Ishmaelite account for the sale of Joseph. Judges 8:24. In Genesis 37:25-28, we see Joseph's brothers deciding to sell him to a caravan of Ishmaelites, who were carrying spices, balm, and myrrh on their way to Egypt. Later in Genesis 37:36 and 39, it is mentioned that Joseph was sold to the Ishmaelites and then to Potiphar. The Apostle Paul also alludes to this episode, although he does not mention Ishmael by name, in Galatians. In the chapters of Genesis, Paul compares Ishmael, born according to the flesh, with the persecutor of him who was born according to the Spirit. Just as at that time the son born according to human nature persecuted the son born by the power of the Spirit, so it is now also. Galatians 4:29. This reference by Paul to the story of Ishmael and Isaac, where Ishmael, the son born of the slave woman Hagar, persecuted Isaac, the son born of the promise and of Sarah, highlights the complexity of the relationships between their descendants, as well as the spiritual and symbolic implications of these events. Now I invite you to pray with me. Dear Heavenly Father, we thank you for guiding us through the stories and lessons contained in the Holy Scriptures. As we reflect on the complex relationships between the descendants of Ishmael and Israel, we recognize the depth of your promises and the challenges faced by our ancestors. We ask you to grant us wisdom to understand these lessons and apply them in our own lives. May we learn from the examples of faith, patience, and trust in you, even in the face of adversity. Help us to cultivate relationships based on love, understanding, and forgiveness, following the example of your Son, Jesus Christ. As we conclude this moment of reflection, bless each person who has been with us, strengthening their spiritual journeys and bringing peace to their hearts. May your love and grace guide us always. In the name of Jesus Christ, we pray. Amen.